This is one of the more important sections in world history that we'll cover this year. If you're interested in politics and understanding the difference between conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, it starts here in the time period of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was actually a new intellectual movement that stressed reason, thought, and the power of individuals to solve major problems. And this was spurred by scholars and also philosophers that wanted to reevaluate the beliefs regarding government, religion, economics, and also education. This period is also called the Age of Reason, using deductive logic to solve problems. Really, the ideology here is that there were two views on government. And the two views come from two major Enlightenment thinkers. First, we'll take a look at the political ideas of Thomas Hobbes, who lived in the late 1500s and into the 1600s. And then on the opposite side, John Locke, who lived in the mid to late 1600s. The first key figure is Thomas Hobbes. And when we take a look at Hobbes, he comes up with this ideology called the social contract. He wrote a book called The Leviathan in 1651. Now, the Leviathan is a sea monster. Okay, a sea monster, something all-powerful like a Godzilla figure. Remember, Hobbes is writing around the time of the English Civil War. This took place from 1642 all the way to 1649. Hobbes basically states that without government to keep order, there would exist war of every man against every man. This ideology is very much pro-government power. He thinks that because people are generally wicked and selfish, they need a strong ruler or government system to keep control of them. And so he comes up with this concept called the social contract. It's basically an agreement between, of course, the people and the government in which they had to give up their rights to a strong ruler in exchange for law and order. Hobbes believes that people are generally selfish, and so that they need a strong ruler to keep order. He said that the best government was one that had total power, like a Leviathan. So that's where the name of his book comes into play. Hobbes actually endorses the concept of absolute monarchy, where the ruler has all power, very limited checks and balances on what the ruler can do. So when you think about Hobbes, you think about government systems or government ideals that have strong government control over the people. People have limited rights, okay, limited freedoms, but they are protected in theory by the government. John Locke, on the other hand, is a little bit more about individual rights and freedoms and less government control. So in general, if you look at the definition of John Locke, you would say that he had more of a positive view on human nature and believed that people could learn from their experience and improve themselves. Locke does not agree with Hobbes. He criticizes absolute monarchy and endorses the idea of self-government. Locke believes that all people are born equal and should have three natural rights. He believes those rights should be the right to life, liberty, freedom, and property, the right to ownership. He believes that it's government's job, and really its only job, to protect these rights of the people, and that government's power should come from the consent of the people. Locke's ideas, okay, if you're listening, inspired revolutions in Europe and, of course, in the Americas, and formed sort of the foundation for modern democracy. So when you're thinking about Locke, you're thinking about less government control, more individual rights and freedoms. All right, next, let's take a look at Roman numeral number 3. We're going to talk about a group of philosophers during the Enlightenment time that advocated for reason. They actually were called the Philosophs, which is the French word for philosopher, and they thought that people could apply reason to all aspects of life. They based their beliefs on 5 key concepts: reason, which is logical thinking; nature, which is the idea that natural things are good; happiness, which is well-being or joy on earth; progress, which is the improvement of humankind; and liberty, which is basically the rights and freedoms of individual citizens, which was protected. One of the first documents, the Bill of Rights, 1689, coming from England. There is a major chart about all of this. It's on page 630. We'll check it out here for a moment. Okay, so as you can see, the ideology here in the Enlightenment is changing from the old idea, which is that a monarch's rule is justified by divine right, that the monarch is in some way, shape, or form God's representative on earth. The new idea, coming from Locke and other thinkers, is that government's power actually comes from consent of the governed people. Now, there is a chart for those of you who have this textbook that goes through all of the different thinkers, okay, and the ideas that they came up with that we're going to cover today, and sort of the impact that those thinkers had. But right now, what we're going to take a look at is some of the beliefs of the Philosophs right here. This chart kind of talks about each of those things that I just went over in a little bit more depth. Okay, we're going to take a look at some of the Philosophs. Now, first, Voltaire. And Voltaire is from 1694 to 1778. This wasn't his real name. His real name was actually Francois-Marie Arouet, or Arouet, however you want to pronounce that. I'm not an expert. But Voltaire was his pen name, okay? He published more than 70 books of political essays, philosophy, drama. He gained many enemies with his attacks on the clergy, the aristocracy, and of course his attacks on the governing bodies. Voltaire used a form of satire, which is writing that uses irony, sarcasm, or wit to generally attack others. Some of these attacks landed him in jail twice, and then he was exiled out of France and had to stay in England for some time. He basically fought to defend tolerant rule, accepting of other people's views. He fought to defend reason, freedom of religion, and also freedom of speech, even though he wasn't the most religious guy. He did have a famous quote that I think is really, really influential. I do not agree with a word you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. That's a really good quote right there. He's saying, hey, I believe in the freedom of speech. I might not agree with you, but I'll go to bat for you if somebody tries to take away your right to free speech. Then we have Montesquieu and the separation of powers. The ideas of checks and balances come from Baron de Montesquieu. He was in play from 1689 to 1775. He's a French writer. He devoted himself to the study of political freedom or liberty. He admired the English system of constitutional monarchy because it had many different branches involved with legislation and judicial issues. He called this form of government a separation of powers, where one body checks and balances the other. This is what he's most famous for. Although his interpretation of the British government was an oversimplification, that's fine, he explained his ideas in a book called On the Spirit of Laws in 1748. His ideas would become called checks and balances, and this is what we say about the president, and it is written in the United States Constitution. So the president, it has the power to veto, whereas other governing bodies have the power to veto other acts and bills and so on and so forth. His famous quote, very good one, power should be a check to power. So the person who holds the real power is someone who can check the power of other individuals. Next, we'll take a look at capital letter D, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a champion of freedom. He lived in the early to mid, all the way to the late 1700s. He's another great philosopher. He was committed to individual freedom. He believed, actually in his quote, that civilization corrupts people's natural goodness. He said, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. So he's basically saying that it's the civilized world, it's the rules and the laws that are putting the harnesses on humans, and they should have more independent freedom. He believed in direct democracy, where people would give up some of their freedom in favor of the common good, but they would have a chance to express their views and opinions through voting. His book is also called The Social Contract, but his views on the social contract were a little different from that of Hobbes. Remember, Hobbes wants people to give up many of their rights for a strong government power. He believes that the argument only needed to be made among free individuals and didn't need to be a social contract with the government. Rousseau actually agreed with a lot of the ideas of John Locke. Next, we have Beccaria, Cesar Beccaria, 1738 to 1794. He was a promoter of criminal justice. He believed that laws exist to preserve the social order and not to avenge crimes. He did not believe in torture or capital punishment. And also he challenged the abuses of the judicial system. This chart on page 632, I already introduced to you. It's a very good one because it talks about some of these major thinkers, what were their ideas, and then what was the impact or effects of their ideas. Next, I think it's really important to take a look at women and the Enlightenment. Unfortunately, even though these major thinkers, these philosophers, are trying to grab rights and freedoms for individuals, they're really focusing on men. Unfortunately for women, there wasn't much of a change. Women were still seen, even by these Enlightenment thinkers, as those who should not be educated and should stay in the home for domestic work. Female writers, though, wrote out against this, spoke out against this, and started a movement that would really gain rights and freedoms for women. Mary Astell, for example, wrote books and essays that challenged the lack of educational opportunities and the unequal relationship for women in marriage. Mary Wollstonecraft, famous writer, argued that women and men both need education to become virtuous and useful. What is virtue, right? Virtuous, understanding, being able to make good decisions, being able to have empathy and moral ethics and things of that nature. She also encouraged, though, Mary Wollstonecraft encourages women to get jobs in fields such as medicine and also politics. Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter, Mary Shelley, would eventually write, of course, the famous book Frankenstein, which has a lot of hidden innuendos within it, actually, if you ever read Frankenstein. And then we also have Emilie du Chatelet. She was an educated aristocratic woman that translated Newton's work from Latin into French, which made this ideology on the universal laws of gravity more available to people in France, which gained her some popularity. Next is Roman numeral 5, some of the things you really want to remember about the Enlightenment. There really are 3 long-term effects on Western civilization. Number 1 is the belief in progress. People can get better. People can improve. Number 2 is a more secular outlook. This idea of worldly, taking in the worldly things, the materialistic things, comes out of the Enlightenment. And of course, the importance of the individual. What can one person do? And then again, that changing idea, changing from, okay, the monarch has the right to rule through divine right, what he says or she says goes, to the new idea, a government's power should come from the consent of the people. Thank you.